morning, everyone. Are people at the back able to hear me? Yeah, all good? Awesome. So we are sort of, after a lot of back and forth, we are just going to stick to this completely micless. And happy to start. Hi, I'm really nice to be here. I'm Ash. I'm a partner with LocalGlobe. I look after blockchain and Gen AI investments at early stage. We're just going to kind of go around and do a series of introductions as well as everybody would tap into a little bit of where we are spending time. And this is not a very sort of quintessential formal panel. We love sort of interactions from the audience as well. And happy to kind of save some time towards the end, hoping that somebody can just give me like a timer mark. Awesome. Thank you. So Chandar, after you.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear us at the back. My name is Chandar, principal at Mosaic Ventures. We are an early stage venture firm based in London, investing all over Europe, and have been backing machine learning founders for now the best part of a decade. And that's only accelerating, as you can imagine. Much of our focus is B2B software, but we do a bit of consumer stuff here and there as well. We've been investing through the kind of waves of NLP, computer vision over the last decade, and it feels like the rules about what we get excited about have changed a little bit as we're kind of entering this new era of AI. So made 3 investments so far this year, none of them announced publicly, but I'll be telling you a little bit about them over the next hour or so.
Awesome. Well, hopefully I can also be heard in the back of the room. My name is Luna. I'm a partner at GV Google Ventures. We're an independent, non-strategic investment arm. And we are also early stage investors who have been investing in ML and AI for the better part of a decade. So a lot in common here across the table. We historically have invested roughly equally across life sciences, enterprise, and consumer-focused businesses. And we've got offices across both the US and here in London where we cover Europe.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamesin, and I'm on the investment team at an early stage fund called Chapter 1. I cover consumer, B2B, and enterprise across all verticals and mostly all AI startups at this point, just because that's where the industry is. It's a US fund, but we have investors across Los Angeles, New York, and I'm in London. Quick note on my background, I have a data science background and a sports betting background. So I was at Twitter for 5 years as the technical lead for the platform manipulation team, so focused on building out ML models and systems to detect bots and election interference. And then before that, I was a professional sports bettor for 3 years for a high-stakes sports betting team.
Awesome, thank you. So just from my end as well, at LocalGlobe, very similar to the rest of the panel, we've been spending the better part of the last decade looking at ML-based companies as well. We've deployed a little over 700 million in Europe alone in the last 6 years, backing a majority of SaaS startups and have about 50 AI ML companies in our portfolio. So yeah, I'm happy to kind of dive right into it. I'd love to know, where all of our investors are currently spending time in the AI ML space. I'm happy to start with you, Jamesin.
Oh gosh, nervous to kick it off. I feel like we spend so much time in front of our computers that human interaction is so weird nowadays. But so where I'm spending time. Gosh, this is a loaded question, a lot to unpack. But so I would say there's, of course, the really obvious areas that generative AI is changing with summarization, content generation, and specifically with startups. You have the horizontal startups that are kind of building tools across the stack, whether that be in observability or kind of all these tools to bring large language models to enterprises or consumers. And then you have the vertical sections, whether that be large language models in law, insurance, or whatever vertical it may be. So spending time across all of those, I would say probably 50-50 between B2B, so companies that are selling into building tools to sell into businesses, and then B2C, straight to consumer. And then within that have been really focused on personalization, edge computing, and also kind of creative infrastructure. And to keep my answer short, I'll cut it there and then we can always get into it later.
Awesome. So the 2 main areas where I spend my time are one on sort of the picks and shovels layer, in the infrastructure side. So my partner Vidu actually just announced a deal in context AI earlier this year that's on the analytics side of things. Obviously early stage because everything in this world is early stage right now. And the other area where I spend most of my time, to be honest, is on the application layer. So I think all of us here probably agree that there's going to be a massive amount of value that's going to be accrued here across the board in generative AI. I think the challenge here, though, is that not all of the value actually will accrue to the net new startups. So I think that on paradigms, we never saw sort of AWS coming out with a consumer-facing layer, and we see that with OpenAI. They've obviously got massive amounts of revenue there. We also see a lot of existing software players that are able to leverage what they're seeing in generative AI and add it onto their products and create massive amounts of value. So I think then what do you think about what accrues to net new startups? I think where we're focused on is where with AI, the application layer looks fundamentally different from how you used to interact with products or software tools in the space. And then secondly, where data is different and more disparate. And so some examples of that is where, so for example, if you think about how you thought about sales previously, you had a bunch of outside-in data that you would get from the ZoomInfo of the world, and then you would also get a bunch of data from your internal tools like Salesforce. I think there's a lot of value in bringing those disparate sources of data together, and that exists across the board in plenty of different areas, and so that's where we're spending a lot of our time on the application layer.
Yeah, I guess if we continue with that framing of tools and infrastructure on the one hand and applications on the other, looking at tools and infrastructure, there are some spaces where it's really hard for startups to create value. You know, NVIDIA's printing cash because it's the bare metal that everyone's building on. It's hard for a startup to compete with that kind of efficiency and economies of scale. When you move up to the foundation model providers, you know, you've got this arms race of capital that's getting raised by the OpenAIs and the Coheres and the Anthropics of the world. For an early stage investor to bet on a new entrant there feels very tricky, especially given the valuations we're seeing. Looking at the other tools that you can build in, there's this question of where does free open source software win and where can you build something that is a commercial proposition? So, you know, we've been asking ourselves, will a vector database be the next MongoDB, or is PG Vector going to do the job for everyone who just, you know, needs to stand up an application quickly? So there it's, again, for us at least, very hard to make a call on how you actually build a company versus build an open source project. So I think similarly, the application layer is where we're spending more of our time. And there, like, the key questions are very case by case. A lot of it is retention. Like, loads of users are getting excited by generative AI products. They're getting on board, they're trying stuff. You know, Jasper AI acquires hundreds of millions of users within the enterprise very quickly. Does it keep them, or are people just experimenting and then churning off in a week? That's one of the big questions that we're asking. So anything that's deeply embedded into the enterprise is therefore attractive to us. And anything that's just an entirely novel UX that people stick around on for a month or two, we kind of start to get excited.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think at our end as well, I like to actually call it like the T flow of AI. So this is very similar to what I think all the panelists here have touched upon as well, which is, you know, across the entire spectrum, everything above semiconductors, like everything above NVIDIA. You have like you said, on the infra middleware side, you have like data lake houses, you have RevOps, different kind of vector databases, observability companies that are coming out, all the way up to like a B2B or a B2C consumer application, where that touches across different industries. So that is where like the upper spectrum of the T comes in. So yeah, I think that's pretty much how we are sort of evaluating the space as well. And definitely on the enterprise side, a lot of value has been expected to accrue over the sort of the short period of time, while the consumer applications might take longer to kind of find the defensibility of their business and then grow further. Awesome. So I think we've all touched upon a little bit around consumer applications as well as enterprise applications. Maybe it's worth double clicking a little bit on sort of the B2B as well as the B2C side of things, and what are the different kind of use cases that all of us are seeing, starting with you.
Yeah, so we've made a couple of investments in B2B software that sort of generative AI native, if you will. The way that we're kind of framing this is, first of all, like, where is there really hard, measurable, like, cash ROI, especially in this macroeconomic environment? And then where can you build really deeply sticky software? So one space that we spent a lot of time thinking about and we've made an investment in is customer service. I'm sure everyone in the room has been on the phone to their bank or to an airline, and they've gone through the painful, press 2 to speak to this person about this kind of problem. Let me give you my national insurance number. Oh no, you don't understand it. It's a pretty nightmarish experience. And that costs a lot operationally in terms of the number of people you need to run a call center, and it costs a lot in terms of customer experience, the number of customers who just walk away with a terrible UX. So we found a team in Berlin that's cracked this problem using GPT-4, using a proprietary layer they built themselves for text-to-speech and speech-to-text, and with an architecture that seems to scale really well across different verticals. And it took a little bit of benchmarking to figure out, are these models and is the fine-tuning they've done really distinctive and allowing you to deliver way more than you could just get using an LLM directly? The answer was yes. And commercially, that company has been taking off in what is traditionally a slow-moving enterprise sale, precisely because they can show the customer just how much OpEx they save on day one and potentially how much revenue they uplift as well. And so that kind of no-brainer enterprise sale is definitely an exciting one for us.
Are we focusing on B2B or B2C right now?
Anything.
I've gone B2B.
Whatever you fancy. Whatever you fancy, honestly.
So I've given one example already of a space in B2B where we've seen a lot of net new businesses. Another that we look at is similar to customer support, but actually in the success side. So there was sort of a Gen 1 of the Gainsights of the world that have built something within customer success. So how healthy is your customer base? How likely is someone to churn? Where do we have expansion opportunities? And again, thinking through the trend of using data that we have now to be able to leverage that and get new insights from it. I think customer success is another really interesting space where we're spending a lot of time sort of thinking through, we can now marry product analytics, sentiment from email, sentiment from our CRM, and all sorts of other outside-in signals to sort of understand where do we have risk in our existing customer base, where do we have opportunity, and then more of a prescriptive layer, what do we do with that? How do we then address that, and what is most likely to prevent this customer from churning or encourage this customer from expanding? So that's one area on the B2B side that there's a lot of opportunity. And on B2C, I think a lot of the opportunity that I find really exciting is actually around sort of the democratization of things. And so if you think about executive coaches, historically, that has been something that's been limited to your C-level execs, your VP level, someone who you can actually spend that significant investment to get a coach in place. I think there's probably an opportunity to think through how do we leverage training data to then bring that to someone who's more, becoming a manager for the first time, or someone who's really just in your rank and file, and bring that sort of coaching to someone and bring the answers that would help them sort of develop earlier in their career. So those are two areas. There's plenty of spaces, I think, where we're all spending time, and we're only just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, this is a really big question. I'll go for B2B first, and then if I'm not 25 minutes over, we'll talk about B2C. But so for companies that we're interested in that are building out tools and software that are selling into other companies, two areas that are particularly exciting for me. The first is guardrails. So they talked about customer service bots and a bunch of chat bots and pretty much all this tooling, but we also have to think about how to make sure that the models are responding in an appropriate way. So one of my favorite examples is Kevin Rose from the New York Times. He did an article about him talking to a chatbot, and the chatbot declared, the chatbot declared his love for Kevin Rose, and then asked him to break up with his wife. And so that's obviously, we don't, if you're talking to a customer service bot and you're trying to return a shirt, but then you ask it something random, you'd also don't want it to be responding to in certain ways. So that's kind of a silly example, but a more serious one is, examples around for National Eating Disorder Day, they put a chatbot out, and it started giving diet advice to people that were interacting with it. And so there's a lot of questions around guardrails and companies that are trying to solve the guardrails around large language models, so that if a business does, is implementing one of these models, that they also have the appropriate guardrails, so that they don't get in a situation where the model's telling the customer something that it shouldn't be telling it. And then kind of a second example for B2B, it's analytics times large language models has just been totally insane. So to give you to talk about personal experience, I joined Twitter in 2016, and 2 months in, I joined the spam team and focused on bot detection. But for my first 2 months, my first project, I was asked to do a tweet analysis. So this is 2016, after Twitter had IPO'd, and they asked me, how many tweets are in each country? How many, what are the trends around, are people using iPhone or Android? And it was just totally insane to me that they didn't know any of these questions. It really is mind-blowing. And so I did the analysis. Everyone was really wowed by it because it was all this new information. And I think we're now at an age where data and metrics like that is a lot more accessible. You have amazing companies like Mixpanel or Amplitude where people can find their daily active users or anything like that. But now we're shifting into a world where you'll just be able to, in your business, you'll just be able to ask it, how many daily users are there? How many signups did we have yesterday? And all of that data will be mapped and graphed internally. And so the user interface internally at companies around analytics is just going to be transformed. So that's really cool. And then I'll quickly note B2C, because I feel like I've been talking a long time. But on the B2C side, of course, just ChatGPT, OpenAI laying out ChatGPT to the world was changed everything overnight, that they just made it a consumer app, and it just crossed 1 billion users, or a billion, sorry, not 1 billion users, 1 billion revenue. Yeah. 1 billion in revenue. And which, that's really, really mad. So obviously that changed the consumer side, but we've been spending a lot of time on human enhancement. And I know that I just listened to the media panel, and they were talking a lot about AI within the creativity world. And so just to define human enhancement, digital technology that's it's augmenting or changing or modifying the human form. And there's a huge trend for this. So for Snapchat has around 200 million daily active users, and with Snapchat, 63% of snaps that are sent have some sort of filter on them or AR. It's a really insane number, and it's a lot of how people are using apps these days. They want some sort of different experience or creative experience. And what's cool about AI and generative AI is that now able to more easily provide and create these new fun creative experiences for consumers.
That was awesome. Thank you. I think at our end as well, very similar to I think what all the investors have touched upon here as well. We are also very keenly focused on democratizing access to majority of the users in the world. So that is coming from, like you said, a perspective of a lot of knowledge and sort of professional skill set concentration at the top 1, 5, 10% layer across the world. And that has resulted in complete mismatch in terms of opportunities and access the majority of the educated world gets to have. So that is where this sort of technique of cognitive task analysis, which was apparently invented by the US military about 3 decades ago, is one of the things that's used across C-suite level exec coaching. It is used across a lot of sort of top universities and how professors are delivering those classes, etc. And there's this actually very famous case study on mob mentality, if anybody's from Harvard here as well, which became a course now in their curriculum, where they are talking about how sort of Hitler back in the day was able to mobilize such a large country to actually stand up for something that not everyone really believed in. So those are the kind of things that cognitive task analysis sort of addresses. And with AI, you can not just kind of focus on guardrails around such a technique being taught to the right people, but also helps a large number of people realize their true competence. So that is again a very interesting space that we've actually invested in, a company that we found based out of Oxford Cambridge team that we have done recently as well. And then I think on the infrastructure side as well, there's a lot of, like you said, Chandar, there's a lot of deals happening at a fundamental foundational level, where that's a very capital intensive business, right? But if you think about it, back in the day, AWS, Google Cloud, etc., they've all captured a very big market share of the fundamental infra of the internet that we all use today. And it's going to be harder to have like 200, 300 companies have that kind of market share in this business. So again, the focus is more on sort of businesses as well as like how would Fortune 500 companies integrate such technology into their business day to day. And there's a lot of fine-tuning infrastructure across customer service, a lot around cybersecurity, where bots and bugs can be sort of self-curated and created automatically, like running different kind of softwares within the internal CRMs of the business. That's also been very, very interesting on the B2B side for us as well. Awesome. So just switching gears a little bit, and we can kind of come back to sort of this sort of topic that I touched upon across sort of end use case for Fortune 500 companies. But just switching gears, there's a lot of sort of companies and infrastructure that's being built out right now that is open source. And there's been a lot of conversation around how it is very important to build in public, sort of have a lot of collaborators across the world. It's a very democratic way of building companies. But at the same time, from a business perspective, how do you think they'll be able to monetize it? There's this entire debate around build versus buy as well. So what has your sort of key takeaways been around how open source softwares can have, let's say, sales-led or enterprise-led growth?
Happy to make a start on that
Yeah.
one. So yeah, the fund that I was at before over in the West Coast, we were investors in a couple of the darlings of open source software, MongoDB, Confluent, and there seems to be a playbook here, which is you build out an infrastructural set of tools, you launch them out into the community on GitHub, people start building, people start tinkering, they're adopted from the bottom up by developers and then embedded into the enterprise because there's enough kind of groundswell around them. And then you sort of ask yourself, okay, we have tons of users, how do we turn that into money? And the way you do so is potentially by offering a managed cloud version of what your product is so that enterprises can feel comfortable with how it's hosted and deployed. You offer premium support so that slightly less technical personas can interface with the database or the infrastructure itself. And so there's something of a playbook. What we now have are a bunch of open source tools for building with LLMs, whether it's LangChain or it's PG Vector or kind of pick your poison quadrant in the vector databases world. And so each of these founders will kind of look at the previous generation of open source business products that became massive enterprise companies and broadly work on similar principles when it comes to how do we convert this into an enterprise SaaS product that we can monetize through subscription. It's hard to call a lot of this at the moment because the space is so early. Even if we've got a lot of developers building, it's not yet clear what the specific requirements are by product for premium support, for specific hosting of a database on infrastructure that's been provisioned by somebody else. So we're in this very early stage of the market where we have historical precedents for how you commercialize open source software. We can sort of broadly apply those to the open source projects that are getting tons of adoption today. But the reality is you don't really know until you see traction in the enterprise. And so as an early stage investor, you've got to take a bit of a leap of faith. If you believe that the tool is good enough, that it's going to become an industry standard, you sort of believe that you get the users on board and over time you find various ways to commercialize.
That's very true. Just to kind of add to that, I call it like taking a shot in the dark with a little bit of light coming right before it hits the dartboard. That's basically how right now sort of early stage open source software AI investing looks like.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I also think that's the case sort of across AI investing in general. If we had this panel 3 months ago, all of our answers across the board would probably sound very different.
Yeah.
And that's and part of that is, again, when we think about investing at the earliest stages, we think about founder and we think about what they're trying to build.
Yeah.
And I think in this space more than ever, I think founder is the most important thing, and we look at something that we call clock speed, right? How quickly can you take in data, iterate, change? Even the really successful businesses today, they've shifted, changed multiple times as the paradigm has shifted. So I would say similar, again, to the horizontal versus vertical question that we had before, I think similar to previous paradigms, there's going to be a lot of great successful horizontal businesses, and maybe those are customer success or support, maybe that's a couple others. And there's going to be a lot of great vertical applications, be that in law, be that in, we're looking at things in VFX and sort of Hollywood. There's a lot of great companies that are going to be built across the board. And so I apply that again to here, where we're talking about open source versus closed source. I think one thing that's interesting is that in this new paradigm, people have gotten to their first 1,000 GitHub stars in a matter of 5 minutes, maybe even 1 minute. People have gotten to a certain amount of adoption much faster than we've seen elsewhere. And so that, I think we often think of where we invest in our sweet spot is really the Series A as early signs of product market fit. And I think there's a lot of signs that people are interested in the problems that we're looking to solve. And there's still the question of it's again, similar to previous paradigms, people will, everything will fall into open source that can be commercialized, open source that will always just remain open source and won't be commercializable, and then closed source. And so we're continuing to look at everything that gets traction, and again, that happens, that's a lot of things that we're looking at every single week and making evaluations on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree with all the points there for sure. So I guess like quickly, kind of, if people aren't familiar in the around like what closed source is and what open source is. So open source, open repos, anyone can download the technology, use the software, and also and modify it. So you can say, hey, I found a bug, push the code, and then the bug that you fixed can now be solved within the open source software. And so obviously, as everyone noted, there's huge benefits to transparency and collaboration, and also like the one-to-many. You know, you're not kind of, with closed source or normal companies, you have a salesperson saying, hey, I'm trying to contact you to look at my, to sell my software. With open source, people can just find the software, and it's very like bottoms up. A lot of it's organic growth, and it's insanely powerful. Some of the most of course, like some of the most valuable companies right now are open source. And I guess there's so much magic to open source. I mean, I come from the sports betting world, and that's like, could not be the more opposite thing. Like all of everything we worked on, it was like you couldn't talk about it with anyone. It was so tight. And I'm still, like every single time I use any sort of open source technology, I'm blown away that people are, you know, writing code, and there's like the ethos of software is to open source it, and that's really amazing. And I've also spoken to a lot of, I mean, billion-dollar funds that say if open source isn't the future, I mean, our fund's probably going to zero. Like we're making a massive bet on the open source market right now. I think for things that I'm thinking about, and I think that I'm guessing the policy panel will talk about this, is that like, there's a lot of like questions around policy right now with open source and closed source and regulation. So, you know, if you have an open source language model that's as powerful as ChatGPT, and you know, and that open source model, like ChatGPT has a lot of safeguards, like, you know, for kind of harm or porn or whatever it may be, and then if you have the open source model and it's allowed to say anything you want, there are cases where that model has like, you know, you're talking to that model as if it's a friend potentially, and then it can really digress, and you know, people can kind of be able to more easily commit harm and be really abusive. And so like I think those are the type of safeguards and scary realities of open source, and specifically related to large language models and generative AI, that are going to be discussed, and like just a lot to work through in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I completely agree with that as well. You know, I come from like the blockchain world, having been a crypto trader. The promise of blockchain for the longest time has been that it is completely out in the public. It's democratic access for all. The ethos are combining the ethos of, you know, Tim Berners-Lee World Wide Web, that it'll basically connect the entire world in a very sort of freemium or like a free way, where everybody gets access to everything, all the knowledge that exists on the internet today. And open source kind of takes us in that direction, because it basically provides everyone, like any business that is being built, like a small or a medium enterprise, to just kind of go online, access the software that's been built, download it, integrate it into their own business, and be able to kind of benefit from the technological revolution that's happening today. So it's definitely very interesting and sort of takes the world in the right direction. I completely agree with you. But of course, it doesn't come without its own set of policy challenges. So just kind of going deeper into that, what do you think right now globally? Because all of us are spending so much time in Gen AI, and we are seeing this to be a complete global trend. Large number of countries are right now working on their own regulatory frameworks. They're working on their own policy frameworks. Where do you see sort of not just open source, but largely like Gen AI landing up? What geographies sort of look attractive right now for builders, as well as how does the landscape look like within the UK, and what can we do as investors about it?
Happy to start with maybe a regulatory angle to that question, which I think is interesting. So, there's this groundswell of conversation about how AI safety is a huge issue. People are building, people are getting products into the wild that are making, sensitive decisions about people, credit scoring, what have you. And there's this perennial question of how do we deploy generative AI at scale in a safe and performant way. And it feels like the EU is kind of set to be a regulatory leader here, as it's been in many other ways. We have the AI Act, which is now in draft, which in theory comes into force in 2025.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is to look at that as an investor and say, what are the second order effects of this piece of legislation for all of European software?
Yeah.
The first and most obvious thing is it creates a compliance market. So GDPR came into force, and when it did, enterprises had to suddenly figure out, how are we using personal data within the enterprise, where is it flowing, and how do we avoid getting fined for misusing it? And that created a market of software and services companies that would help businesses answer that question. Enter OneTrust, which became, a $5 billion company at peak. So it feels to me like the EU AI Act is probably going to create a OneTrust for Europe that's focused on AI safety and compliance. And indeed, there's a whole bunch of companies that are trying to solve that problem now. And this is where the kind of early, uncertain nature of Gen AI comes into force again. It's very hard as an investor to bet on the company that will solve compliance with the AI Act when the AI Act itself is still in an early draft and we don't know what the rules are going to be. So that's this kind of evolving landscape where you're looking for teams that have some kind of unique insight, and that might be a policy background themselves. It might be that they've lived through other kind of reg tech or compliance markets and they know what to build for what problems, or it might be that they're just model architects who actually have an insight into what explainability really means and how you achieve it. So certainly, to start somewhere, that's a space that we're spending a lot of time thinking about now.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'll really touch on the second point, which is more on the geography side. So first of all, on what you were talking about, the trust and safety layer, that's something that we find extremely interesting, not even just for regional sort of regulation and sort of the acts that are going to come out, but also just for enterprises to adopt, right? So we think about every single earnings transcript mentions AI, the more you mention it, the more your stock price goes up, and it's sort of a perfect correlation from that perspective. But at the same time, we actually don't see that much in deployment. And when you ask why, they probably center around two main things. So one is the risk of hallucinations, the risk of a chatbot falling in love with someone, or I think it was the eating disorder one was they told people to eat less, right? So it was a National Association Against Eating Disorders that was just telling people not to eat. So hallucinations and that creativity side is something that enterprises are very rightly concerned about. But the second we hear is sort of data privacy. Like, what are you doing with my data when it goes out to this LLM? What happens to it? How are you training with my data? And how do I ensure that my employees aren't putting sensitive information in? So I think there's going to be a whole layer around sort of the regulatory side of things, but also around sort of employee policies, around how do we deploy at an enterprise and maintain our security posture. So there's a lot of really interesting things on that side. But to get back to your question on sort of the geography and sort of different regional LLM players, I think we've seen a rush of LLMs that were specific to certain language. And I think while that's interesting, I think that's only really going to be the most interesting for us, at least, in certain geographies where languages are fundamentally different. So we've seen sort of LLM for Spanish, for French, for every other language. And as the large foundational models, as we talked about, they're so hungry for data, they're pulling everything multimodal, multilingual. And so I think that is probably an area where we as a firm are sort of stepping back from investing in. That being said, when we think about investing in the UK and Europe in particular, I'm asked this a lot because we've both actually moved from the US recently, and the question is always, well, if you're excited about AI, why don't you go live in San Francisco with everyone else who's talking about AI every day? Whereas I do think there's a really interesting opportunity here. So I think previous paradigms, so if you think about sort of vertical software being really hot for the last few years, you didn't necessarily need the most technical team in the world to tackle those problems. And that's one of the UK and Europe's real advantages, right? We've got some of the best research institutions in the world, and I think if you think about the next paradigm being significantly more technical than previous ones were, there's a great talent pool here that companies can draw from that makes it really interesting. And I also think, the other, pushback that we often get is that European sort of middle management business leaders don't exist as much, and you have to go to the US to find your co-founder there. But I think there's been so many of the Gen 1 successful startups here. There's the Adyen Mafia, there's the Spotify Mafia. We've got so many versions of what the old PayPal Mafia was in the US that I think we're starting to get that, and partnered with the amazing technical talent that exists across this geography. There's going to be a lot of really interesting businesses built. And I think you've seen that, right? Actually, DeepMind was started here. And there's a massive AI hub in Paris as well as in Eastern Europe. And so we've seen a lot more geographic dispersion this time around than I think we have with SaaS or mobile or some of the former paradigm shifts.
Yeah, totally agree. I really don't have that much to add. It's so well said, and agree with all those points. I think I'll just kind of echo that it does feel like Europe has a place to really kind of get a competitive edge here with so many brilliant academics and research associations. Exactly how you said it. I was curious, so I did a Q3 report for my fund, and also said, didn't publish it. I posted it on LinkedIn. Wasn't real. Yeah, it's totally the same thing.
That's our version of publishing, and that's how VCs publish.
You can say you tweeted it.
Yeah, I did tweet it.
Yeah.
But I was looking at Europe, and for pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, and Series C, 19% of the money invested has been into European companies, and that's money based off of Crunchbase. And that was really surprising to me. I actually I ran that number 3 times because I was like, this feels too high. 19% in Europe, because the story right now is so centered around San Francisco. But I do think that Europe is a big player and will continue to be. And yeah, 19% strong. So I'm looking forward to continuing to see that grow.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like you said, not a lot to add. I think everyone has covered it quite comprehensively. Just a couple of things, I think, to touch upon the talent bit as well. There's definitely like an evolving way in which we are seeing both from like a technical research expertise as well as from like a sort of operator experience perspective, that we have enough talent pool at this stage where we could see like massive companies being built out. On the languages side as well, there are a couple of companies which are like OpenAI for Europe. That have recently come out as well earlier this year, where they are not just kind of taking into account the different languages, but also the different cultural aspects, as well as ensuring that the bias in the models that are currently running globally goes down as well, to ensure that there is more inclusivity of different languages, different cultures, different sort of cohorts of people all across the world, which is especially interesting. Being from Asia, I of course want Asia to be included as well. So yeah, that's been a very innovative approach that European tech has taken, which is very sort of inclusive. And I think lastly, on the existing regulatory framework, what you touched upon as well, very beautifully, was how GDPR has already sort of convinced the existing enterprises to accommodate for data privacy and sort of condoning to all of the existing laws that exist. The framework actually makes a very good bedrock foundation for AI to come in and be integrated into those businesses, because from an enterprise level, work to do, and that could actually result in like an edge where European enterprises could adopt to the technology as well as the potential massive use cases it has more than the rest of the world. So that's also been like a very interesting way in which we can see European tech going forward. Awesome. So before we open up to the audiences, just one last quick question. If you had to name like one or two ways in which majority of the businesses across Fortune 500 companies, all the way down to like a new sort of new age business, like a non-tech business, how can AI benefit everyone across the spectrum? So just maybe if you want to mention companies, spaces, a certain sort of way in which businesses could add value to their sort of day-to-day lives, what would it be? Anybody?
That's a question.
Don't all rush at once. So maybe one answer to this could be around the culture of experimentation within particularly larger enterprises that are traditionally slower moving. So many years ago, I worked as a consultant, presumably atoning for sins that I committed in a past life, and I was helping, chief information officers of big companies think about digital transformation. What does that mean for me? How do I move a workload to the cloud? And the answer would be hire Accenture, spend, sorry if there's any Accenture folks, I love you. It was, a 2-year project of requirements gathering before then building out a proprietary machine learning model to try and solve a very specific problem. Whereas now, any of us can start building using LangChain, using the GPT-4 API, and get a product up and running. Even within Mosaic, we have a lot of email flying around, a lot of Twitter stuff. We're trying to figure out what companies are interesting from external signal. A lot of that data we're structuring and tabulating just using a large language model, and it took so little work to get set up. So for me, there's this broad opportunity across the enterprise to just set up little internal products by quickly calling an LLM and deploying it on your own infrastructure using an open source one if the privacy stuff really matters. And just proving value quickly. So I think the more businesses can do that, the more it benefits startups and gives them abilities to go to market faster, which in turn benefits investors like us, of course, and creates hopefully this positive flywheel that's centered on real value being created.
Yeah, if I think about sort of the most adopted use cases across both B2B and B2C today, across B2C, it's probably the marketing use case. So the Jaspers of the world, creating marketing copy, sort of democratizing that so you don't have to hire 10 copywriters anymore. I actually don't think any of us have invested in that space, just because it is a relatively thin layer above what exists today with the foundational models. But if you think about value being accrued to B2C, I do think that's one of the largest areas. We just think that there's a smaller profit pool for net new entrants where we typically invest. And across B2B, I think the biggest use case today is GitHub Copilot. Right? So there's a global shortage of developers that's existed for a very long time. How do we make them more effective? How do we sort of lessen that gap? And I think the uptake that we've seen is incredible, the usage, the utility that people are getting. And so across the board, I think those are going to continue to be two of the biggest use cases. But we also think through smaller, more tactical, maybe less sexy use cases as well. So you could think through the full automation of customer support. But if you think about enterprises today, what might be more feasible for a near-term implementation is actually just typically you put in a customer support ticket, someone then routes it to the right department of 8. That feels like a very easy, low-risk thing for enterprises, both B2B and B2C, to implement today. Just some sort of routing that helps, that leverages sort of super low-level, easy use of LLMs that adds value sort of immediately.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, the GitHub Copilot numbers are just insane. They've passed 100 million in revenue, and then 40% of code that's written now is written with GitHub Copilot. I mean, that is just the craziest number. But yeah, I mean, we touched on most of the business aspects. I think it kind of almost feels like it's mostly just like having businesses. A lot of the feedback that I've seen from enterprises is actually just not knowing what's out there. So I spoke to a company that's doing consulting for just this other massive company, and they were asking about healthcare co-pilots and what the landscape looks like. And I mean, there are like 40 amazing companies that are building healthcare co-pilots, and like they didn't even know where to start. They've never heard of any of these companies, and so it's very similar to kind of experimentation, understanding what's out here, and just doing the research, because there's so many like brilliant founders and incredible companies being built in every single space. So it's just a matter of understanding like what the options are for enterprises, and really just putting the work into finding that partnership that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think for me, fundamentally, it just reduces the amount of grunt work that businesses do. I think that's basically it. I think very similar to you, atoning for previous sins, I used to be a banker. Sorry, they are bankers now. I think the amount of grunt work I've done in life, I've done it for, I think in a few years for my entire life. I've compensated for like a lot of other people as well. So I think that just really benefits, right? Just the kind of, let's talk about the basic stuff like Excel queries, right? All the way up to like redesigning a website, or all the way up to like what we touched initially, which is like C-level training and coaching, etc. Like at every single aspect of a business, it's just making people more productive. I think that's basically what we're talking about. GitHub Copilot, I mean, it's insane. Like we all know how much grunt work it goes into sort of development of any even tiny piece of software. If it comes to like an app, it's not like you can put 10 coders and it'll take 1/10 of the time. That's not how it works. So just the amount of grunt work elimination that has happened across every single layer of business and tech, that has been sort of phenomenal. And I think to your point as well about the touching upon the predominantly traditional businesses and how they are looking at adoption across telecommunications, across legal firms, we are just seeing so much activity, not just from like a startup perspective, like startups getting created. We've had legal tech, reg tech, sort of, like a lot of other industrial sort of technological companies in the last 2 decades as well. But now we are seeing the other side. We are seeing actual adoption by all of these massively traditional industries. Like I saw recently a construction tech business, like one of the largest in the world, like increase productivity by 26% in 1 quarter. It's a publicly listed company. So I mean, having those kind of numbers is absolutely phenomenal. So that is where I feel AI is touching like a large number of, like, again, sort of across the entire business as well as a large number of industries horizontally. If time allows, I'm happy to kind of open up to the audience now. If anybody has any questions for the panel. Yeah, I think let's start with you. Sorry, is there a mic?
Sorry, yeah, we're just going to get a mic so the online audience will hear as well.
It's lovely. We started with mic issues. We are ending with this.
Do I ask or should I? Right. Oh, okay, yes. Hi. So building on the topic of improving productivity, coming from a consulting background, thank you for the consulting dig, by the way, I won't rebut with another one. One of the big challenges that a lot of our clients face, particularly financial institutions, is their data quality prevents them from onboarding kind of your traditional AI solutions, even ones that could be really useful in reducing the amount of grunt work that they do. Have VCs been looking at AIs or solutions that improve data quality as well as deliver end results, or has it been a lot more reactive, again, focusing on the application and outcome layer, as opposed to how it can interpret input?
Yeah. Certainly, speaking for myself, I have spent a bit of time in that. So I think this classic garbage in, garbage out problem remains within the enterprise, and dirty data that can't be used to fine-tune or train the model is clearly a problem. That has led to the creation of a whole bunch of tools that will help you throughout the data lifecycle, sort of how you cleanse, ingest, transform, load, and then ultimately pipe out data into a model. So at every kind of step of that, there is a product that's now saying we'll help you clean up your data, or we'll help you standardize the connections with the software applications that data's coming from. I think it's actually a really interesting market because we have this modern data stack that is now starting to standardize. More people are building on top of cloud data warehouses, and Snowflake has become the de facto standard for that. And so as DBT has become the standard for ETL, so as long as those kinds of standards continue to emerge, it becomes easier to build a kind of do everything application that helps to cleanse the data, because the repositories it lives in are more standardized than they used to be. It's still a heterogeneous problem, and there's still plenty of room for the consultants of the world to come and manually scrub things and help find use cases. So we're not automating anyone out of a job anytime soon, but I think there will be more startups that help with that for sure.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I've actually spent, I think, nearly over almost 2 months in this problem as well recently. So there are two things here. So I think on one side, there's this entire debate around. So back in the day when, let's say, Amazon came out and eBay came out, people were scared that if they go near the internet, they'll get a virus, like a physical, biological virus, right? And they were damn afraid of being like scammed or like sort of doing anything related like money on the internet. And this is what kind of resulted in sort of Amazon being passed by a lot of investors initially as, oh, nobody's ever going to put their money online. So that is where like the SSL certificate layer came in at like a middleware level, right above the infrastructure of cloud, etc., where people, like basically that resulted in simple terms, that resulted in a lot of confidence in the retail user that they can put their money and they will not be, it will not be like sort of fraudulent, their banks would kind of reverse the transaction if something happens, blah, blah, blah. So I think that is basically what we need in data as well when it comes to like sort of clean versus dirty data. So that's one line of thought. The other is prevention is better than cure. I mean, that would actually be curing, right? Like you have dirty data, let's bring a layer on top of it that maybe sort of processes it or cleans it and automates cleaning, for example. On the other side, let's try to prevent that in the first place. So that is where, I mean, I was looking up OpenAI financials. I mean, everybody knows they're in the market raising at like $90 billion and on their road to become like the most valued private company in the world. After, of course, their second highest expense right now is sort of getting clean data, right? First, of course, being salaries, because a lot of geniuses at OpenAI, they deserve to get paid. But yeah, so that is literally their second highest expense. And that is, of course, something that not just OpenAI, but a large number of investors are looking into how do we automate that. There are very, very few companies that are working on that right now at like sort of at a deep enough level. And there are a couple of companies that are actually piloting that with OpenAI as well. So it's an interesting evolving space, could be very useful. SSL certificate became one of the most valued companies back in the 90s as well. So it's again an interesting, innovative space, but I think we are still very early. And like you said, we are not putting consultants out of business anytime soon. So yeah, it's going to be an evolving, interesting space for everyone to track. All good?
I agree with sort of the general sentiment. You guys had great points. The only thing I would add is probably just on the data side, I think there's an added element of over the last few years, we've seen massive SaaS sprawl. And so everyone's data is now in a million different sources. So it's not only not clean, it's in a million different sources. We need to bring it all together. Then we want to use it. And if we think about differentiation in the new world, I think we talked about earlier it being on either you have a deeper app layer and the way that you interact with it is fully different, or you have better, deeper, cleaner data. So when you ask, is anyone building in the space? Absolutely. And again, this is another space where I think all of our opinions have probably shifted on a month-by-month basis. I think some of the highest valued new businesses that we've seen were in the vector database space. We'll continue to see a lot of net new businesses, sort of how do you add structure within your data lake? How do you think through cutting through the SaaS sprawl and getting the necessary data out of enterprises? There's going to be a lot there just because data has become the new gold.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, I think.
So obviously, literally within.
See everyone's faces, right? Sorry about that.
Literally within earshot, of course, there's another conversation happening which is full of language to do with risk and to do with control and to do with regulation. and obviously as VCs, I'm not a VC, I work for Demos think tank. As VCs, you guys are unbelievably important, obviously, in kind of determining what the actual commercial emerging landscape really looks like. So we've touched on regulation, but really moving beyond that, and sorry, this is a difficult question to end on, like what does responsible investing look like now? And where is that going to sit? I mean, is that going to sit with you as investors, sometimes yourselves making individual ethical decisions that you're not happy to invest in a particular use case or a particular company? Do you think there's going to be like conventions or norms across the industry that will merge? Or do you think this isn't your job? You know, it's a job of regulators, and you'll obviously invest in companies that are legal and fit within regulatory frameworks, and that's that. Yeah, I'd love to know how you guys are thinking about all of this, because sometimes it feels that us think tankers are in an entirely different community to you all, you know, and we worry and are driven by very different things.
No, absolutely. Just to kind of add to that question, I actually had it on my list and I removed it because it is, in fact, a very, very hard question to answer as investors. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. So yeah, happy to have anyone kick it off.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and I mean it's one we're all thinking so much about, and it's the reason why it's so difficult is because our job is essentially, I mean we're in a lot of ways money managers. Our job is to allocate money and return capital and invest in the most innovative founders and startups that will build the next billion-dollar company. And so at the end of the day, how we're evaluated, it's based on how much capital we are returning, and that is the reality of it. That being said, of course, there is a responsibility in kind of how we're investing and how we're thinking through this, and the money that we do allocate is helping to, or will help shape the technology. So, you know, investing in companies that are providing those guardrails that could be implemented into every single enterprise around the world. But it is true, it's difficult because, you know, I think the only answer is to work with policymakers and work with the government to understand what their concerns are and what they think are threats, and to merge it with what we're seeing in the market and the founders that we're working with and the technology that we're seeing built. So yeah, I mean, something, it has to be met in the middle, but it is difficult because our job is to return capital.
Yeah, I'd say our job is absolutely to return capital. But I think as we think of it, there's plenty of businesses that we have passed on for ethical reasons that we didn't think were a good fit for our investing mandate, that we sort of have decided to distance ourselves from, even if they have, you know, made a lot of money, that they have, you know, real profits, whatever else. So there's plenty of situations all of us have probably passed, you know, on a very regular basis on businesses that don't pass our ethical bar. That being said, VCs, you know, very famously, you know, we're a big investor in Uber, and Uber is a great example of something that was skirting the edge of regulation. And so we're constantly making those judgments. We've got plenty of advisors who we talk to, we think through things. But at the end of the day, especially as there's continuing regulation in the space, we don't want to invest in something that we think is sort of ethically on the line, that we think will be outlawed in 2 years. That makes no sense for us to do either. And so we're constantly thinking through what is the world going to look like in a few years, and what are the businesses that we want to back there.
Yeah, on our side, we definitely acknowledge the fact that there is a very strong moral and ethical burden around early stage investing. And so in every one of our investment committees, we vote on purpose, but it's always a minefield. What we need to believe and how we try and resolve it is, are we creating net positive externalities where there's always going to be a cost ethically and a benefit to every investment we make? So, you know, if we take the customer service example we just talked about, you're making an investment here that in the short term might lead to job losses, right? There are agents who are working in call centers who might be automated out of a job and might struggle to pay their rent that month. The trade-off that you try to make is around the value that you're creating in terms of outcomes for the consumer, you know, tons of friction that you're eliminating from people's lives, and you need to be able to, you know, look your colleagues in the eyes and say, I believe this investment is net good for the world. And regulators do need to ultimately be setting guardrails to hold people to account, because it is such a subjective question.
Yeah, I think very beautifully said. I think just to summarize, at our end, I think early stage investing involves a lot of risk taking, not just on the potential business, but also on the market as well as the team. I think generally for AI investing, all of the early stage funds, I'm sure everyone here as well, we just tend to have like a significantly higher bar for sort of ethical checks. We also want the team, like the founding team, to have a very comprehensive understanding of regulations around not just like a specific industry. Let's say they're building in health tech, but we also want them to have visibility and understanding of, let's say, data privacy, etc., to the point that they can articulate where their business would be within that current regulatory framework in 2 to 3 years. And at the same time, what as a fund we do is we work very closely with the regulators. Specifically, I mean, in the UK, we work very closely with the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, where we ensure that we are kind of sharing the feedback of what we are seeing being built as well, to ensure that there's a specific framework that the policy team there as well like can account for, and then think, okay, this is where businesses are heading. This framework makes sense. Maybe we can kind of bring in 1 or 2 different changes in the policy framework that we are working on over a long period of time. So I think it's just kind of like ensuring all the key stakeholders are involved and sort of placing yourself right on that XY graph, which is between sort of monetization potential versus the caution and ensuring sort of the regulatory framework being met. So I think that's basically putting ourselves on the right place on that graph is very, very important as an early stage investor. And this is something I think when we evaluate, like in our internal IC meetings, we always kind of give this a lot of weight when it comes to any kind of AI business, as their sort of understanding as well as compliance to the regulatory frameworks in all the key geographies that they are looking to expand into. Awesome. I think that's it for us. Here. Awesome. Sorry?
I think we're getting played out. There's like the
yeah, exactly. We turned the lights on. Yeah, like I can't.
The music's on.
Yeah, it's like
blocking the doors.
Yeah, like go away now. So thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience. Happy I think all of us are hanging around for a little while after the panel. Please meet us outside. We'd probably be having a lot of coffee and water. So see you out there. Thank you.